All right, so welcome once again to another exciting episode of MTS. If you are a student enrolled in the class of the seminar, please do not forget to sign in. Last week there were a couple people who forgot to sign in, but I saw them, and in my profound charity, I made sure to write their name in. But please don't do that because my memory is not so great. So please sign in. But more importantly, let us welcome our guest today, which is Carl Craver. Now, Carl Craver, it turns out I've written some stuff. Carl Craver here is a professor of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis, whose eclectic, to put it mildly, interests span philosophy of science, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of biology, and technology-driven research in fields such as optogenetics, genomics, and neuroimaging. Am I doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So Dr. Craver's first book, Explaining the Brain, so that's settled, okay, provides a framework for considering how norms of scientific explanation apply to physiological sciences. And his most recent book, Searching for Mechanisms, Discoveries Across the Life Sciences, offers a mechanistic account of the process of biological discovery. And among his many, many interests, Dr. Craver studies deficits in agency and moral reasoning in the context of episodic memory and amnesia, and indeed will be sharing his latest work on that topic with us today. So let's welcome Carl Craver.
Thanks a lot, Colin, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a late Monday afternoon to hear a talk. This will be the third book. This is, in a way, a précis of the third book, but a microcosm of what is a macrocosm of the third book. And it's going to have to do with the relationship. It's really intended to be a richly interdisciplinary project that combines, that cannot be done without knowing a little bit of science and without knowing a little bit of philosophy along the way. And what I really want to do is to demonstrate the essential interaction of those perspectives. And this project really started by accident. Several years ago, it was the case that at Washington University we would have every year a very famous memory researcher named Untitled Chapter would come and spend a semester with us. And at one point I was giving a talk for a group called on neuroethics, which at the time didn't exist. And I said, I don't know what that is, but I'll come and talk to you about something. And I gave a talk about actually consent and memory. And Endel, to my shock and amazement, was sitting in the back of the room. I didn't know him at the time. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, we never ask these questions. This isn't what scientists are interested in with memory. They're interested in what episodic memory is and what sort of mechanism could possibly be responsible for it, but we never really ask how it is that episodic memory fits into our lives as persons, how it contributes something that can't be contributed by other cognitive systems to our being the kind of thing that we are. And I'll say more about that in just a second. So I think that there are many different ways to get into the talk. That conversation with Endel Talbing led, he said, if you're going to work on this, you've got to come up to Toronto and you've got to meet KC. This is Kent Cochran right here, and his mother Ruth. Kent died a few years ago. But Kent is perhaps the most famous individual who has, in virtue of having really extensive brain damage, lost episodic memory in particular, and he's become in many ways the primary case that you go to if you want to talk about somebody who's lost episodic memory and wonder what that means for the person. For me, as I showed up, I was just a philosopher and I didn't know how to do things like get consent out of somebody or even do neuropsychological experiments. But nonetheless, there I was standing on the front porch of these people's house, waiting to meet Kent for the first time and waiting to meet his mother. And the reason that I was there was precisely because I was interested in how his episodic memory deficits, which he got as a result of a motorcycle accident that caused widespread damage throughout his brain. I got there to him through my buddy and collaborator, Shana Rosenbaum. I was there precisely because I wondered whether he was capable of doing things like giving consent. Because I wanted to know, if you've lost your memory, what do you lose as a person? Not as a cognitive machine, but as a person, what is lost from your life? And people have talked about this, but I hadn't thought they had talked about it very carefully. So I was partly just concerned with what do we do with Kent, and how are we supposed to treat him today? But of course, Kent isn't alone. There are a long tradition of people who have very serious memory deficits. Over here, this is patient HM, Henry Meliason, who's probably the most famous amnesic subject ever. This is Brenda Milner, who was the first cognitive neuropsychologist the first neuropsychologist to spend a lot of time studying him. This is William Scoville performing an operation. Scoville did the operation that removed the hippocampus bilaterally in HM as a result of his intractable epilepsy. Brenda Milner was the person who did the psychological studies and became really very famous for characterizing his deficit extensively. But for those of you who've been around for a while, you're probably familiar with Clive Waring, who, because of herpes simplex encephalitis, also seemed to have very extensive memory deficits. I'll say more about him in a bit. This is Sue Corkin. This is Endel Tulding. I'll be saying a lot more about Sue Corkin in just a second. She was the person who was largely responsible after Brenda Milner gave up responsibility for HM. Sue Corkin became sort of the gatekeeper for research on HM for many, many years, and she's become the subject of a recent book, which I'll talk about in just a second. But really what I care about is the person. There's a general practice about how to get consent out of these people, and then there's just a philosophical puzzle for me, which is really what's driving this whole thing. How is it, in the second book of the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche asked the question, what would nature have to do to build a creature that had the right to make promises? That's a great question. And that's exactly what I care about. Right? So how are moral and practical agents implemented in the cognitive machinery of our brains? And how is the space of reasons, this is just fancy talk, for us being the kinds of people who do things for reasons and that can be held responsible for the things that we do, that we have to make judgments about things, and interact with, have responsibilities, etc. And how is that, this philosophical sense of ourselves, related to the stuff that all you guys study, the machinery between our ears and the musculature of our body? I take it, I don't need to tell you guys this, I need to tell philosophers occasionally, the brain cannot be a homogeneous jelly and pull this off. It has to be broken into different parts, and part of what we can do is to try to figure out what does this part contribute, what does this part contribute, and I think that hopefully we can drop some tethering lines. I'm not going to solve this big problem in this book, but what I really want to do is to try to drop tethering lines between these two ways of viewing the human organism. And in particular, using neuropsychology to ask, what's left of the person in this highfalutin sense when you drop out individual capacities like episodic memory? How does it affect our status as persons? So what does episodic remembering do in our lives as persons? I put this in here because I think it's my earliest memory is walking through the grass behind my grandfather's house. He didn't have a lot of money. He in order to seed his yard, he went to the local golf course and they had leftover seed laying out back. And so he stole or somehow got his hands on a bag full of this seed. And it turned out that it was seed for making the greens on golf courses. So my grandfather's backyard was just a giant green with this incredibly delicate grass. And I just remember running through it. I could feel the grass. I could smell the clover inside of it. And that's the kind of thing that I have in mind when I talk about episodic memory. A very vivid, experiential, emotionally laden recollection of some past experience from my life. And I want to know, what would my life be like if that were to drop out and leave everything else roughly intact? That's exactly the question that opens Oliver Sacks' exploration of Jimmy G, the Lost Mariner, in his classic book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And in many ways, I'm inspired by Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks was a better, I think, clinician than he was a philosopher. And in some ways, his observations on Jimmy G, I think, leave something to be desired. And I'll try to make some improvements on Oliver Sacks' treatment of this case over time. But the question, is it the case that having lost your memory, that you're just adrift on the ocean, a lost mariner with nothing to hold you up, nothing around you to give you any bearings, you're just adrift in life? If that's the case, then having lost your episodic memory is very devastating for you as a person. That is, you're no longer what philosophers call person anymore. You cannot orient yourself towards others. You have nothing to triangulate on. And so to call you an agent or to think of you as something that's doing anything purposive at all becomes strained. Similarly, with the case of HM, who's been studied by Cochran and Milner quite extensively, one could begin to ask the question, as Philip Hiltz did in his book, Memory's Ghost, what was left of HM's life? HM lived in a home and continued to do experiments, but we only get glimpses in the scientific papers of what their lives were like outside of in ways that can't be represented in bar graphs. I'm going to show you some bar graphs, unfortunately, in a while. But I think a lot of what we need here is some ethology. We need somebody to go in and really observe behavior and report on that, and we don't have it for these people. And then Kent, as I just mentioned. I put this picture in here because this is a picture of his brother's wedding, and you might notice that there's a difference between this haircut and this haircut. There's a 30-year difference between these photographs, but I put this in because shown in this picture, Kent was able to name all of the people in it. That's my dad, that's my mom, my brother, my other brother, his wife, etc. But then he looks at the picture, he says, hey, what's up with my hair? And the answer to that question, Kent was a bit of a rabble-rouser and a roadie for rock bands and made road trips from Toronto down to New Orleans and did a lot of drinking, at least. He decided on the day before his brother's wedding that he should give himself a permanent. The first permanent of his life. He has no recollection of having done that. He has no recollection of having been removed from his house because a train crashed in the backyard spilling toxic chemicals. He doesn't have any memory of being on the boat when his brother drowned. He doesn't have a memory, so far as we can tell, of any event from his life. He knows lots of things about the world, but no event from his life is he able to describe in any detail whatsoever. All right, that's the background. So it's these kind of individuals that I'm interested in looking at, and I'm wondering what's left of their life in the absence of this sort of memory. But to get very specific, just to ask, what is a person? Are these guys persons? That's a huge question. But maybe we can narrow it down a little bit and just ask, could one of these guys consent to participate in an experiment for themselves? That's the question. And wrapped in that, of course, is, well, what are the kinds of things that should be allowed to consent for themselves? What would nature have to do to build a creature that had the right to consent? Right? So it turns out that this book by Luke Dittrich, who's a journalist for the New York Times, how many of you are familiar with this book and the controversy? 3 of you. Luke Dittrich is William Scoville's grandson, the guy who performed the surgery on HM. And Luke Dittrich discovered at some point that this was the case, and was a lifelong friend, in fact, of Sue Cochran, a family friend, and found out in the process that among the other people in the original paper on HM, I think it was 1953, 1958, one of those two, there were 9 subjects. One of them was HM with epilepsy. The other ones all had schizophrenia. And one of those other ones was Luke Dittrich's grandmother, William Scoville's wife, who Scoville had performed this operation on. Dittrich discovers this about his family past and loses it, the way that you might if you discovered that you had Nazis in your family history or something like that. A sudden reorientation of your life and what's going on, what's up with Grandpa, what did he do to Grandma, and all of that. And then he starts looking into the case of HM and writes this book, which is a withering criticism, in some ways, of Sue Cochran's treatment. And one of the things that he points out, he says from at least 1981 to 1992, this is the key point in the book, there's a lot going on in here. This is what I'm going to focus on. Henry was the only person signing his informed consent forms when he visited MIT's Clinical Research Center, where he would reside as a live-in test subject for as long as a month at a time. Cochran ultimately recognized that Henry's profound amnesia might make it hard to argue that the experiments she and her colleagues were conducting on Henry were properly consented. As she wrote in a statement that she provided to me, quote, his difficulty in retaining new information raised the nagging question of how we obtained consent. 10 years consenting for his own experiments. Now, he's mad about this, and there's a lot of other stuff in the book that he claims that Cochran destroyed data, for example, and we don't need to get into all of that. But there's a reaction. Everyone in the memory literature comes to Cochran's defense at this point. They write this letter to the New York Times in which they say things like that they are disturbed by these accusations, It presents a biased and misleading vision of Sue Cochran here. It's contrary to everything that they know about her as a scientist, a colleague, and a friend, that she dedicated her entire life to studying this stuff after all. She made major contributions, not just to memory, but to Parkinson's disease, etc. She's a highly accomplished scientist, inspiring teacher, beloved mentor to students and faculty, a champion of women in science. No mention of consent. Not addressed. James DiCarlo, department head, has to say something about what's been going on in this department. He says, well, he addresses the allegation that research records would be destroyed. He says, no, not true. Nothing of import was left. Says he addresses the allegation that the finding of additional lesion in the left orbitofrontal cortex was suppressed. There was a claim that they were hiding, that there was damage somewhere else in the brain. We don't have to address that. And he addresses the allegation that there was something inappropriate in the selection of Tom Mooney as Mr. Meliason's guardian. This is after the end of those 10 years. They then appoint a person who was, I think, HM's third cousin to take over as the guardian at this point. And they say, the court agreed to that. We went through all the legal procedures. Nothing wrong there either. But again, this issue about whether he could consent for himself for 10 years just gets dropped. And I think that the reason that both the scientist letter and this thing from James DiCarlo don't touch it is because it's a hot potato. And people are just really unclear about what exactly one should say. What is required for somebody to give consent? And can you really give consent for yourself if you can't remember having given consent in the first place? That seems puzzling. And you must admit, I think with me, that there's at least a prima facie tension in all of this, because if you look at Sue Cochran, this is Suzanne Corkin's book, retrospective on the life of HM, where it's called permanent present tense, suggesting that somebody with this kind of deficit is somehow locked in an eternal now, a trope that's repeated time and time again describing these people, trapped in the present, trapped in the now, bound to the present, bound to the current, those sorts of things. But if that's true, if there is no future for you, if you are bound to the present, if you have no past and you have no future, you are toast as an agent. You are not a person. You're not the kind of thing that can reason about what you ought to do and why. You can't even consider what the consequences of your actions would be because there is no future. There's nothing to consider. So personhood, autonomy, and agency all seem to be questioned by the idea that these guys are somehow trapped in the present. So the very way that she was selling the research, and the very way that Endel Tolding has promoted the research over years, claiming that it's distinctly human, that it's perhaps the basis of civilization, but the more you trump up, and I'm going to use that word, the more you trump up the value of episodic memory to get your papers published and your books read and your research funded, the more you make it seem implausible that somebody who's lost this capacity ought to be able to speak for themselves about what you're about to do to them in your experimental setting. So you find these people like Della Barbara and LaCourte, for example, neuropsychologists. However, amnesic patients not only do not consciously remember their past, this is the other thing, it's not just about the past, it's also about future imagining. Say more about that in a second. Amnesic patients not only do not consciously remember their past, but also they can't imagine their personal future. They're severely disoriented in their present world. In light of these observations, amnesia from hippocampal damage as well as confabulation cannot be considered pure episodic memory deficits, but rather pathological conditions affecting an individual's entire subjective temporality. Tolding. We can, if we wish, close our eyes and think about what we did 10 minutes ago or how we celebrated our last birthday. This kind of sense of time makes a huge difference to what we are and how we live. If we retained all our other mental capacities but lost the awareness of time in which our lives played out, we might still be uniquely different from all other animals, but we would no longer be human as we understand it. Down here, Roberts in 2002 asked whether KC and HM are like rats. Trapped in a present, no knowledge of their past, no knowledge of the future ahead of them. For philosophers, these things ring out as danger signs. That when you start talking about people in this way, when you start talking about things in this way, you're excluding them from the class of persons. And why? Well, Endel had this really famous conversation with Casey at one point that is worth repeating, and it's repeated in almost every article on this topic. So Casey was asked, let's try the question again about the future. What will you be doing tomorrow? Casey says, I don't know. Do you remember the question about what I'll be doing tomorrow? Yeah. How would you describe your state of mind when you try to think about it? And then there's a 5-second pause, and he says, well, blank, I guess. And then other places he says it's like being asleep, or it's a big blankness sort of thing, or it's like being in a room with nothing there and having a guy tell you to go find a chair and there's nothing there. It's like swimming in the middle of a lake, there's nothing there to hold you up or do anything with. Lost mariner indeed. So this kind of, this view that they're lost, trapped in time, lost in a sea of time, and something like that, is not without reason. People say things like this, and it's often reported. And then, of course, as those of you who follow this literature at all are aware, people grab onto this idea, and now suddenly it's everywhere, and episodic memory does everything. It's not just an awareness of time, past and future, but everything else. It's crucial for decision making. It's a motivational brake that counters impulsive and short-sighted decisions. It allows our judgment of current situations based on similarity to previously encountered ones. Precious help for making appropriate decisions. It gives us flexibility. It supports adaptive behaviors and self-control. It's this kind of foresight that's a powerful tool to guide our actions. Acting prudently in some situations may rely on the way that we imagine the future. So again, all of these decision-making processes, can I consent if I can't imagine the future, if I can't make decisions about this, if I don't have the precious help of episodic memory? So there are two central questions here. I think one's philosophical and one's empirical. The big question is, can consent for himself, or HM? The conceptual question is, what do you have to be able to do? Like, what do you need to be a consenter? And then the empirical question is, can people with episodic amnesia do that? So is episodic memory a necessary component in the mechanisms that are required for us to do the sort of thing to give consent? Before I address this, though, I want to convince you that it's actually worth addressing. When I was standing there on the front door to this house, I recognized full well that we faced a kind of dilemma. I didn't know, standing on the front step, whether Kent does or does not deserve the right to consent for himself. And if he does, and I withhold that right, then I've harmed him because I've violated his autonomy. He should be allowed to speak for himself about whether he wants to participate in the experiment. But if I give him the right when he doesn't deserve it, then I put him in jeopardy of getting himself into a situation that no self-respecting person would want to get into. So either way, we risk doing him wrong, and it's just not clear what the right thing to do is. What we did is not this, but there are really three options here. The first one is consent by proxy. You just go to Ruth. You get consent from Ruth. Leave Kent out of the picture. After all, he's trapped in the present. He can't think about this stuff anyhow. So just get consent from his mom. That's what we do for kids, young kids. It's what we do for people who become seriously cognitively impaired late in life. Why not do it for Casey as well? That sounds reasonable. The drawback is that, again, he might be perfectly capable of making his own decisions, and then we shouldn't let mom make decisions. I don't want my mother making decisions for me when it's me. And why should we change that for HM? We have to have a reason to. And it seems like we deny him that right, even though we don't have any reason to. Like, we don't have any evidence yet that he's not the kind of thing that deserves the right. So we're stigmatizing him without any evidential justification whatsoever, except for this conversation. What we do, and this is the workaround that many people use, and I understand, having given this talk a few times, that this is often used with children as well at a certain age, and that this is becoming a kind of standard practice. I hope to convince you that it shouldn't be. Is to say, well, we're going to get consent from both of you. I'm going to give mom the consent form, I'm going to give Kent the consent form, both of you are going to sign the consent form. Right? If Kent can consent under those circumstances, he does when he signs it. If he can't consent, because he's not the kind of thing that can, and Ruth, then Ruth is doing it on his behalf, considering the things that one ought to, and Kent's signature on the document is just a record of his assent. Is that you've all had a basic ethics of research course, and so you understand the consent-assent distinction. That's what we're hoping for in this case. So either way, we're doing okay. We're covered, no matter how it goes. But the point that I want to make is that this is no different than consent by proxy. And the reason that that's the case, I don't know if this is a totally convincing argument, but it is to me. Notice that the only time that consent by proxy and this dual consent model are different from one another are cases in which Kent consents and Ruth withholds her willingness to. If Kent and Ruth both consent, the experiment's a go, right? If Kent and Ruth both withhold, the experiment doesn't go, right? If Ruth says, yeah, we're good to go, and Kent says, no, we're not, the experiment's over, Kent does not assent, and the experiment's done. But what if Kent is sitting there saying, I want to do some more of these puzzles, and Ruth has better things to do with her time and says, no, it's time for us to go. Well, that's the moment where this dual consent model would allow some wiggle room for Kent to speak for himself. But at precisely that moment, the decision calculus here says, no, we default to Ruth. And so exactly the same consequences follow from either way of proceeding. So if we think we're somehow improving the situation by offering dual consent, we're actually just fooling ourselves, and we might well be fooling the subjects in these experiments, the participants in these experiments as well, flat out telling them something that's not exactly true. You might wonder whether it's worth it. On the one hand, we avoid the stigma because we don't say right off the bat, you can't consent. And so there's some advantage to that. But it's really only a Band-Aid on the stigma, because if he can think his way through this situation and follow the chart that I just showed you, he's going to recognize eventually that this is a crock. And the Band-Aid only works if they don't figure it out, at which point they're going to be angry, lied to, etc. And those are the kinds of things that consent laws were supposed to help us to avoid. All right. The third option, is to allow Kent to consent for himself. And then we just have to ask, is his incremental vulnerability to harm worth the potential violation of his autonomy? Does he have autonomy to violate at all? And if so, how vulnerable is he? Dual consent doesn't allow us to sidestep these questions. I think we've got to choose, that is, between giving him the right to speak for himself and not giving him the right to speak for himself. Dual consent is an illusory gain over those two options and really just amounts to allowing Mom to speak on his behalf. So we got to choose. How are we going to choose? Well, here maybe some philosophy can get us started, get us down the path a bit. Just some conceptual considerations that seem relevant. So I think, when we think about this the first time, we're likely to just sort of wing it and have the thought something like, well, see, at the moment you give consent, you need something to connect that moment to the moment at which the thing happens. And maybe memory is the thread that you can stretch between the moment of consent and the moment of fruition. And if you snip the thread, then the consent no longer reaches all the way to the moment of fruition. I think something like that idea must be behind what Dittrich isn't very clear, nor are any of the other articles that have picked up on Dittrich's complaint. They just say, how can you give consent if you can't remember having given consent? They never pause to ask the question, do you have to remember anything to give consent or for consent to last? Well, think about it for a second. We usually get it in writing, right? That's why we hand the pages to them in the first place. Why do we do that? Presumably we do that because we know that memory is faulty. There could be a question at some point about whether one consented and what exactly one consented to, and so long as it's written on a piece of paper with signatures on it, we're pretty clear about what was consented to by whom and when. And we do that presumably because we recognize that memory by itself could fail in these circumstances, and that it's not we need better thread connecting these two moments if we need it at all. It's also the case that when we teach people intro research ethics, we don't say, make the consent situation really memorable. Show up with clown nose on or something. Make loud banging noises. Do it in a room that's got uncharacteristic decorations for the university. There is no requirement to make consent memorable. And when we want to know whether somebody actually gave consent, we don't say, can you tell me what I was wearing? Can you vividly describe the sentence that I asked for consent with? You say, what did you consent to? And did you consent to it? Semantic questions, not episodic questions, seem to ground whether the person consents. Thirdly, we often give consent to things where we aren't going to be conscious at the moment when the moment of fruition arrives, like having a knee replacement or something. You say, yeah, go ahead and do the surgery, but at that moment you won't be remembering anything, so there's no possibility of a thread between these two things. And in fact, you might not even exist at the moment that the thing that you've consented to happens. So I want to be shot out of it. I want my ashes shot out of a cannon. I think it would be probably wrong to do that to me if I hadn't asked for it. It would really reflect a certain disrespect, one might think, if one wasn't asking for that disrespect. But we typically require consent in these circumstances, and there's no possibility of anyone remembering anything in those circumstances. So I think we're just wrong in imagining that consent's persistence is somehow like a physical object, or the persistence of a physical object. It's a change in the social structure of things. What's permitted, what's allowed. And that change can persist even if we burn the document. It's an agreement that happened between two people. We might not be able to prove it in a court of law, but its persistence doesn't require the maintenance. It's not like an atom or a baseball traveling through space. Consent doesn't work like that. Think about a marriage, for example. Crush the ring, burn it, throw it in the ocean. Doesn't matter, doesn't change that. Or a friendship, doesn't have to be written down or anything like that. What matters is the state of things at the moment of consent, I think. That really, these considerations, I think, push our attention to not the bridge that connects the moment of consent to the moment of fruition, but what is their state at the moment that they consented in the first place. That's what matters. So there we need some evidence. What are they capable of? Are they, in standard biomedical ethics, 3 issues arise here. Can they be properly informed? Do they give their consent while fully capacitated? But they're clearly not fully capacitated in this case, but relevantly fully capacitated. And can they do it voluntarily? Those are the 3 questions that we have to address. The rest of the talk will just be making my way through those. But some caveats here. First, I'm only going to be thinking about episodic amnesia. So the loss of this very vivid kind of recall. Semantic memory is going to be intact in these people, so are procedural forms of memory. In fact, part of what I'm asking is, can we do with those much of what we need to do with these others? I also think that this question is an empirical one, and I've got the first generation of studies to report. But it's always possible that 5 years, a year from 6 months from now, there's a study where I go, that's a problem. Okay? And I also think that this is somewhat context dependent. There's a difference between agreeing to generate past tense verbs from present tense verbs for $10 an hour, and agreeing to have surgery, and buying a house, and getting married. And as the stakes increase, we might demand more and more out of the ability to be informed and more out of capacities. Most of what I'm talking about here, though, are sitting down at a table and doing some puzzles. That's what HM was doing for most of his life. All right, can he be informed? Well, KC, when we asked him, was always able to define consent and say, oh yeah, it's allowing somebody else to do something that they weren't previously permitted to do. And he could even say in his own words what these studies were. We did it every single time. And Shana, I'm talking to Shana about this, every time she asks him to do exactly what she's supposed to do, and he gives her exactly the right response. And he typically, when repeating this in his own words, will say, and I have a right to quit this experiment any moment that I want to. So he understands what consent is. It's also true that he has generally preserved semantic knowledge. For those of you who haven't spent a lot of time with this recently, it's counterintuitive, but there's a whole store of information about the world that's entirely independent, it seems, of this knowledge that we have of these specific events from our past. So KC knows, for example, definitions of objects, and he can name familiar objects, and he can name familiar people, as I showed you in the picture before. He understands how things work, and he understands how to do things. But most importantly, I think for this case, he also knows himself pretty well. We gave him a list of, actually Endel Tolman gave him a list of words describing his own personality. And he gave the same list of words to his mother. And he asked them to both answer these lists and to rate on a 5-point scale how true it was of them. And their answers agreed 73% of the time. I don't know if my mother and I would agree 73% of the time on this test. This has also been demonstrated in all of these other individuals with amnesia that I won't go into. And importantly, his preferences were really very stable over time. If you asked him what his favorite baseball team was, it was the Toronto Blue Jays. What's his favorite beer? Black Label. What's his favorite band? Dylan. He had it down. And it wasn't the case that when I asked him those questions the first time, it was different from what happened 2 years later. Some people have suggested that episodic memory is part of our ability to understand other minds. That turns out to be just false. Maybe in the service of time, I won't go through all of the experimental studies here. There was a radical hypothesis by Randy Buckner that all of these different projections, projecting yourself into other minds, to other places, were all part of one system. But that turns out, at least with other minds, they get sarcasm, they get other people's beliefs, they can tell from looking at people's eyes how they're feeling, they can complete people's thoughts in vignettes saying how they would feel in those situations, etc. There's just no evidence at all that they're mind blind in anything like the way that people talk about individuals with autism. But then you say, well, he's trapped in the present. Wasn't that the key thing, is that he doesn't have any concept of the future? Well, we had another conversation. This one was written by me. Another conversation with him, and it went like this. What is the future? Oh, events that haven't happened yet. Can you change the future? Yeah, how? By doing different things. Does what happened in the past influence what happens in the future? He says, yeah. Does what happened in the future change what happened in the past? He says, no, not at all. Does what you do now influence what happens in the future? I guess so. With several of these guys, they start getting philosophical on us at some point. Well, if you change the future, if you change the past, does what you do now change what happened in the past? No. These questions are trying to get at, is there a future? Is there a past? Do you understand the difference between those two? And do you get, furthermore, the idea that time, there's a flow to time? And philosophers distinguish the A series and the B series. That's all complicated and whatever, we don't have to get into it. But the idea that time passes and that causation might be asymmetrical, that causes are before effects, but causes don't come after effects, and we're trying to assess that. I don't know what went wrong with this. If an event is in the future, will it always be in the future? No. Why? Because time moves on. I should point out that one relatively famous philosopher, Christoph Hurl, had claimed that people with episodic amnesia could have no sense of the passage of time. And what motivated this study was just to say, yes, they can. Yes, they do. And in fact, now we've repeated this with 2 other cases of individuals with this form of amnesia, one of whom had hippocampal damage at birth, perinatally, and so has never developed the capacity for episodic memory, but nonetheless has an understanding of time. In fact, he was the most, this is John in London, and John was the most florid in giving answers to these questions. Well, you see, time is like a, and he goes on and on and on with his answers, and they're sensible. I don't know what's right or wrong about time travel, but they're sensible. I think maybe another thing that people think is that if you've lost your memory, then you can inform this guy at this time, but he's not the same as the guy that the experiment's going to be done to, because identity is grounded in memory. I'm not going to get into this in great detail either, but I just want to point out that that view is circular and has been rejected by nearly every philosopher who's dealt with this topic. The reason is just that so it's a plausible thought. What makes me the same guy as the 12-year-old is that I can remember stuff that the 12-year-old did. And that's the thread, again, that ties me to that thing, and that's the thread of identity. The problem is that if I remember something that Caroline did when she was 12, if I have a vivid recollection of something that in fact happened to her, that doesn't make me identical to her. That means that I'm having a non-veridical memory. Non-veridical memories cannot ground identity. Only veridical memories can ground identity. And what are the conditions on veridical memories? Well, they have to have happened as remembered, and it has to have been you that it happened to. If I'm remembering something that happened to someone else, it doesn't count. So the very concept of episodic memory that Locke needs to ground his theory of personal identity presupposes rather than explains the concept of identity over time. So although this is an appealing idea, and I understand why scientists often reach for it and think that that's the right way to think about this, it's a disaster conceptually. And it's been known to be the case for a long time. Even if you think, by the way, that Kent at time t sub 0 and Kent at time tn, greater than 0, are not the same person, given what I've already told you about his self-knowledge, who would be better to speak for Kent at the later time than Kent at the earlier time? After all, they agree more than Kent and his mother did. So why not give it to him? All right, so can Kent understand what he's consenting to, the first leg in all of this? Well, Kent has semantic knowledge, I think, sufficient to ground his understanding. And nobody appears to be better informed about what future Kent would want than Kent at the time of consent. What about decision making? How am I doing on time, Colin? Just so that
You're all right.
You said you wanted me to be done in 45 minutes.
I want a lot of things.
But I'm now at about 40?
You're about 40, yeah. You're doing okay. And we're pretty...
I'm going to go blistering through this. Does he have the capacity for decision making? Well, I told you that he knows about the future, but I didn't tell you whether he cared about it. Because it might be that you know that there's a future, but if I say, like, I'm going to give you $10 tomorrow, you say, I don't care about $10 tomorrow. I want the money. I'll take a penny now, because tomorrow is nothing to me. Right? Discounting of the future. Does he care about it? We'll get to the discounting in a second. Even though he knows that there's a future, this is a very complicated diagram. I know that it's a controversial test. It's Zimbardo's temporal perspective inventory. All of us are different in these respects, apparently. Are we negative about our past, positive about our past, fatalistic about the present? Nothing I do matters. It's all useless. Hedonistic about the present, or future-oriented. I really have to get my work done today because there's something important to be done tomorrow. And this red line here is just Philip Zimbardo's idea of the good life. And this is the 50th percentile. So for Philip Zimbardo, you should be relatively positive about the past, not negative about the past. You shouldn't be especially fatalistic. A little bit of hedonism is good, and it should be combined with a certain amount of future orientation. But again, the 50th percentile is right here. And what I want to point out is that on present hedonism, you might expect that somebody trapped in the present would only care about what's happening to them now, at floor, for Kent. And in fact, none of them is above the 50th percentile in that category. Similarly, for fatalism, I mean, all these people live with their folks at home and have for a long time, and their life is not especially thriving. But none of them are above 50th percentile in fatalism. The dominant orientation is actually future orientation in most of these subjects that we look at. All right. I mentioned the discounting. Is it the case? I mean, if you are trapped in the present or in a permanent present tense, then you might think that if I'm offered $100 in a year versus $1 today, that I'll take the $1 today because the $100 in a year doesn't mean anything to us. So my friends Len Green and Joel Meyerson, who are apparently some of the most famous guys doing work on delayed discounting, gave me a bunch of tests, and so that we ran them for two different subjective values, for $100 rewards or $2,000 rewards. And we asked them to discount it over 500 weeks at different times. I won't go into how the test works. We can if you want in the question and answer. All I want you to notice is that the controls and the and this is for KC and DA, this is for HC, and this is for DG. They're all different ages, and so we needed different controls. And the lines are right on top of one another. That is, they discount the future at exactly the rate that the rest of us do. There are some recent findings that suggest that we use episodic memory to nudge this up. Nothing in this displays that effect. This doesn't just confirm that. Nothing in this confirms that. It's also true with probability. So if you ask them how much they'll pay for a 90% chance of $100, their lines and the control lines line up with one another very, very well, except this guy, DA, who's an accountant, and who is much more conservative than the other guys. But otherwise, it's not like they're risk-prone, impulsive, trading everything tomorrow for something today. Their decision-making doesn't reflect a presentist orientation. They don't avow a presentist orientation. They know that there's a future, and they care about it, and they make decisions in ways that respect it. Does he make risky decisions? So in order to see, there's a contrast between being a risk taker, somebody who just loves to go like, mountain biking and rock climbing and scuba diving in caves and that sort of thing. And then there are people who are impulsive. That is, that they like to do the things at the first opportunity that's available to them. Those things are very difficult to distinguish from one another, but Darlene Floden in Toronto developed a task that's designed to separate those two things. The task involves presenting 5 cards, either in an ascending presentation or a descending presentation. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The subject can tap the screen at any given moment. When they do tap it, the cards are turned over, and if the winning card is beneath, they win a reward, and that reward is inversely proportional to the number of cards present on the screen when they choose. So in the ascending condition, if they choose early with 1, and that happens to be the winner, the payoff is very big. The reason we do it this way, in both an ascending and a descending order, is that impulsive people are going to choose at the first available opportunity in both of these conditions. People who are risk takers are going to wait and either wait or either choose immediately in the ascending presentation, or wait until the end of the descending presentation and choose there. This is what impulsivity looks like, where this is the add condition and this is the subtract condition. This is somebody who's neither. This is a risk taker choosing with very few cards present, and you can see that he doesn't fall into really, it's not this category or that category. It's much more the neither category for KC. So he doesn't appear to be impulsive. Can he anticipate regret? If you can't imagine the future, you might think, oh, well, if I say, well, you're going to be in this experiment, it might be uncomfortable for you, and then, maybe what you do in that situation is you imagine yourself in the future pleasantly sitting in a psych lab and wanting to get out, but feeling like you've locked yourself in, and that would lead you to change your views about what you ought to do. One way to study anticipated regret is in economic decision-making tasks, one of which is known as the Allayed Paradox. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the Allayed Paradox. The Allayed Paradox is something that we're all prone to, or most of us are prone to, where we change our preferences under conditions where we shouldn't change our preferences. So with this chart, we're looking at a choice between A and B, or a choice between C and D. The choice between A and B is as follows. You get $1 million for certain, that's A. Or B, you got a 10% chance of 5 million, and a 1% chance of 1 million. Or a 10% chance of 5 million, and an 89% chance of 1 million. Now, which one of those do you choose? Well, if you're like me, you probably think A. So, B has the higher expected utility, but I'm just the kind of guy who ends up here. And then I'm miserable for the rest of my life as the guy who ended up here. Right? Now this one down here is, there's an 11% chance of 1 million, or a 10% chance of 5 million. And if I give you that choice, most of you are going to be like me, and you're going to go for the 5 million in that instance. And what's bad about this, what makes you irrational, is that you've just shifted your preferences under a condition where you shouldn't. And that becomes apparent if you just block this out. This choice and this choice are identical to one another, right? The only difference between the two of them is that in this case, I've added an equal amount to either sides of the choice. And it's a fundamental axiom of decision theory that if you add equal amounts to either side of a choice, you shouldn't flip your preferences. They should stay exactly the same as they were before. But if you're the kind of person like me who anticipates regretting ending up in this situation, maybe that changes your calculus here. And part of what you're trying to do is to avoid that future regret. So we decided to use this as an assay of whether Kent could anticipate regret. And the thought was, if he's not the kind of guy who can anticipate regret, then we expect him to make non-Allaysian choices, unlike me. But his choices, I'm not going to show you the diagrams because they're complicated. I'll just tell you, he's just as Allaysian as the rest of us. He flips here. So he knows there's a future, he cares about the future, he doesn't discount the future any differently than the rest of us. He's not impulsive, he's not a risk taker, and he seems to have the capacity to anticipate future regret. And what else do you need to be able to make a decision? That's just a report about these things. And if you ask him about regret, he says, oh, what does it mean to regret something? He says, oh, it's something that you don't like or wish that you hadn't done. Can you name some things? He can't name a single, can you name some things that a person might regret? If somebody lost a large sum of money, what are some things that a person might do if they feel regretful about something? Try to make it right. What are the kinds of things that they might do that would show you that they had a feeling of regret? You can tell by the tone of their voice, they'd be mad at themselves, etc. We did him on the green moral decision-making tasks, but I really don't like those tasks. It just turns out he's just like the rest of us on that. So when it comes to making decisions, at least on the studies that we've already done, it doesn't look like he's totally different from the rest of us. We've already decided that it's the moment of consent that matters, and at that moment of consent, he seems to be able to take into account the factors that are most relevant to whether he should be consenting to participating in the experiment at all. Just to quickly wrap things up, let me get to voluntariness and just be honest about my concern here about voluntariness. My main concern is that I'm not sure that he would ever recognize that he should withdraw from the experiment. And I don't know. It's an open question. And part of what makes me think that maybe I'm wrong about this is that we know that there are forms of emotion-based learning that persist even in the absence of episodic memory. So Damasio has this description of the, we won't talk about Boswell just yet, but the Clappa Red Test, where you stick out your hand and then somebody has a pin hidden in their hand and they shake your hand. You withdraw, and then the question is, will you reach out your hand the next time they try to shake your hand? And the story that people often tell about amnesics in this situation is that they stop doing it after a while, and then say, and you say, why? And they say, well, sometimes doctors have pins in their hands, which is a totally semantic kind of answer to this question. Boswell is another amnesic subject that Dan Trinell and Damasio looked at in the 90s. And he divided the people in the home in which Boswell was living into good people and bad people. People who were nice to him and people who were mean to him. And then showed him pictures after a period of time of doing this and asked, who do you want to hang out with? And to a person, he sorted the good from the bad, even though he had no recollection of having interacted with or met any of these people. So that suggests that even if he's not constant, that emotional learning is happening. And it's possible that somebody could be in an experiment, becoming uncomfortable, recognize that they're becoming uncomfortable, remember that, get out of the experiment. But I also want to point out that on the Iowa gambling task, that requires somebody to learn how to choose between advantageous and disadvantageous decks, that people with amnesia never get the Iowa gambling task right. Well, there's one example of somebody who did. It's in this Gupta paper, but it's an N of 1. And none of the other studies that have been done on it suggest that they ever get that choice right. That is much more sophisticated than learning not to stick your hand out when somebody's sticking it with a pin. It requires a kind of learning that goes well beyond what we've talked about. But I do worry sometimes, even in KC, he's a chance on the Iowa gambling task. I don't think I'll go into that. So I'm just going to conclude now. So here's what I want to conclude. Remember, this is all provisional. Casey might well be able to consent for himself. And I think HM might well have been able to do so. I don't see any good reason why he couldn't have. And I think dual consent, at very least, is a bad way of proceeding. It's slightly dishonest. If we think it through, it's a hollow offer. So I hope that's a kind of progress. But then I also think that what we're veering towards, and I know I've only given you negative stuff, but that's what neuropsychology is good for. Neuropsychology is good for, even without this, you can still do that. It's really lousy. If Casey fails a test, we never have any idea whether he failed it because of his memory deficit or because of damage somewhere else in the brain. And the same was true with HM, honestly, and the same is true with Boswell. In neuropsychology, this is just a limit on the inference. But given the inference that we've done, we can show that it doesn't seem like episodic memory is required for consent to last. That's just the conceptual issues that I was raising. But perhaps memory isn't required at all for one to be capable of being informed, understanding what's going on to them, and being able to do so voluntarily. Because there are forms of learning and memory that can handle those sorts of tasks. And I think it's important that we focus on these questions, not just because I think when we ask these questions, we're actually getting at the thing that brought us to neuropsychology in the first place, or that made us care about neuroscience and cognition deeply in the first place, is that we want to know how this mysterious thing, us, is possible in a world that's made up of nothing but biological causes. And the way that we can make some progress on that is by finding out how you can damage things like us by damaging the biological causes. And if we can do that, we can begin to drop these tethering lines between this philosophical conception of humanity as persons responsible for what they do and doing things for reasons, and this scientific view of human beings, where we're a collection of cognitive machines co-localized in a body. And if we can bring those two things into some sort of agreement or conversation with one another, we'll be making progress on the very thing that brought us to this topic in the first place. And I hope that that's what we're starting to do somewhat incrementally here. All right, thanks. That's it. Donna and Shana are at York. They're awesome. Melissa Duff is at Iowa. She did a bunch of stuff on narrative with us that I didn't talk about here. Pascal Boyer is a colleague of mine at Washington University who does a lot of work on discounting and suggested those discounting experiments in the first place. Jake Kurzak is Melissa Duff's graduate student. Nazim Kaden, Len Green, and Joel Meyerson all worked with me on moral reasoning and discounting behavior. So I need to say thank you to those guys. All right, that's it.
So our tradition, just to remind everyone, is that the grad students have the first 10, 15 minutes or so,
Perfect.
and then we open it up. And would you like to moderate yourself?
Sure. Are you a graduate student?
Yes.
Go
Really fascinating topic. I was wondering about something similar a few days ago with regards to schizophrenia and what is another similar delusional states, or states prone to delusion. And I was curious, when you brought up the Iowa gambling task, you kind of touched upon something I'm concerned about, which is that while HM and KC and the amnesiac patients are able to successfully perform on these subtasks, or these rather narrowly defined tasks, is it possible that the deficit exists in some combination of those features, or wondering about the interaction between those?
Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously a problem with psychology that our control over the experimental situation is only bought at the expense of carving off the experimental situation from the situations in which we're normally acting. Episodic memory, in fact, it's not even clear that there is a way of testing episodic memory independently of the other cognitive. There's no process pure test for episodic memory. And most of what we do when we remember stuff is a weird mix of the memory systems. So there's a bit of it, even in our episodic memories, the classic Proust and the Petite Madeleine, he says, oh yeah, I remember the taste of this thing, that sounds episodic. He said, and it was on Sundays because I remember church bells, and we always ate these things on Sundays before church. And that's not a specific episodic memory, that's a memory, a general memory about where this thing was, why it was on Sundays, and why Sundays and the church bells being related to Sunday. So the memory itself is an amalgam of these different forms of memory. When I said that I thought that an ethologist was really called for, it's partly for these reasons. We take him, we give him these tests, we say, you're fine. You're fine on that test, you're fine on that test, you're fine on that test. Now put him in the real world and see how things go. And many people who work with these have said this to me, that it all looks great on the psych tests, and then you ask them to make a box of macaroni and cheese, and everything falls apart. We did ask him to make a box of macaroni and cheese, in fact, and he was fine. He was able to put the sequence of acts together to pull that one off. But would I love to have he's no longer alive. there are these other individuals. To do the test that one would want would require, I think, sustained observation, would require taking them out of their home and doing things with them in the world, and would require a huge amount of trust between researchers and the family. And I think one thing that I've learned through all of this is that all of this depends crucially on maintaining that trust. And if you start asking for things that look wild, you're jeopardizing years, decades perhaps, of research. And so yes, would I like these things to be more environmentally adequate, more embedded in real-world situations? Yeah. But if I came here and told you a bunch of anecdotes about KC moving around the house and didn't show you a single bar graph, you'd go, what the hell was that, and why do I pay any? That's not science. That doesn't. So we're left having to play this game, doing stuff that's real, honest-to-God science. But it would be nice if it was also supplemented with what we really want, which is detailed, which I think is also scientific, detailed observations of how these people move around in their natural environments. I think that's exactly what we would want studying corvids. I think it's exactly what we want studying chimpanzees. And unfortunately, it's a feature of science that control and environmental adequacy are in tension. And no less in neuropsychology than in animal experiments, non-human animal experiments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if my question is relevant or totally off topic. So if it's off topic, just, I don't know, ignore it. But, so Casey and like these patients, they have the concept of the future and the past, you know. If I'm drunk, I have a concept of the future and the past, but maybe I don't have the concept that I will not remember being drunk, or the activities that I did while I was drunk.
Yes.
And so if I was in an experiment, you would say I couldn't consent because I'm drunk or something. But you also mentioned something about like we do consent things like in our everyday life. So like when we're married, we sign this paper that's like our consent to be married to this person. But when we're in a friendship, there's no like document that demarcates when consent starts and stops. And I'm wondering if this is related at all to questions of like sexual consent in situations when you're like drunk, when you're like sort of only existing in this present moment, but you don't know that you're only existing in this present moment. You're perfectly aware at that moment of thinking that you know about the future.
This is a great question. Let me take them in order.
Okay.
My wife told me never to talk about sex in public, but I'll get there. I think what's going on when you're drunk is a lot more than just having a memory problem.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you've got a memory problem, you're impaired in many ways that I think would show up in decision making and whether your preferences would have remained the same, etc. In that way, these guys are not like drunken people, and so I think there's a real difference there. Now, I do think that these questions about consent and at what point, I think that these are really fascinating and incredibly difficult questions about what is required of consent. One thing, sorry, I just hear my wife's voice, like, shut up, girl. Well, I'm going to say it, and then it's only, I'm on film, what can go wrong? I do think that at some point in a marriage, for example, after a long period of time, that consent is something that often happens in ways that are not explicit. Shall we now? Would you please sign this document? And it might even be a sign of something being wrong if things had to proceed in that way in a relationship that had been going for a period of time. Part of what I'm saying is, however, that consent is something that can last even if it hasn't been written down, even if there isn't some thread connecting those moments. And then there's a question, at what point does that consent cease to exist? If you give up on the idea of a thread, when does it stop? So at 5 o'clock you say, yeah, tonight, why don't we go have a couple of beers? and then let's go back to my place. You go out for a couple of beers, and then suddenly your memory's gone, but you consented earlier to going back to your place. So is it now the case that that has somehow broken the thread? And I think in those cases the answer would be yeah, it's broken the thread, because you're no longer somebody who's thinking properly about what you're doing or in control of the situation as it might unfold and evolve in front of you. And so exactly the conditions under which whatever it is that allows consent to last, it's the preservation of the social conditions that's required. And as those social conditions change in drunkenness, I think that then it would be right for us to decide that that's a situation where the consent relationship that happened at 5 o'clock is no longer in effect. But I think I think that's a very touchy, obviously, because there's no physical thing to point to and say that's when it ended. And I think that's what makes these situations sometimes really, really very tricky and controversial about when consent is actually, when the social conditions have changed to the point that consent no longer holds. And I think in my experience in the last 30 years of watching the Kavanaugh hearings, for example, that our sense of what the social, I do think of these things as socially, it's up to us to reason our way to a proper way of thinking about what consent ought to be. And I think that we as a culture evolve in our understanding of that. And I think that since Kavanaugh, I'm not to let him off the hook in any way, but I do think that the idea of consent has been morphing, and that we're trying to get clear on the social conditions that are required for its preservation. And I think that's a very healthy thing to have happened, but I think it's still very much under negotiation. And I don't mean to presume that there's just an objective answer against which I'm going to read all of this. I think one way to hear this talk is as part of that conversation. What really is required? What really must you be able to do? And we don't at the moment have answers to that, but doing this neuropsychology is just an entry to starting to ask those questions. When does it break? And I don't think memory alone is the breaking condition. But if you've changed from somebody who really understands what's going on to somebody who doesn't understand what's going on, then that strikes me as, even by the letter of the rules as we currently understand them, is a change that violates the conditions under which that agreement persists. Did I get the question? Okay, great. You and then you. Yeah.
So somewhat related, has anybody done any work on people who don't have amnesia, asking them, hey, if you imagine yourself developing amnesia later, do you think you'd be uncomfortable consenting to these things? Because throughout your talk, I'm kind of projecting forward into the future. If I get dementia, if I get Alzheimer's, I don't know if I'm comfortable now with the idea of having, the opportunity to be a research participant without having the phenomenological sense of consenting, all these other things. And if people are uncomfortable with it, maybe that should help inform how we treat these subjects. And that is a separate question than what capacity, sort of empirically, biologically, whatever, do we need to be able to consent to these, which I think was actually the majority of your talk.
So what worries me about the Alzheimer and dementia cases is that, although we tend to talk about these as memory disorders, there are a lot more than memory disorders. And there might be stages of those diseases where it looks like a pure memory, like early stages of Alzheimer might look like they might mostly show up in a memory component rather than elsewhere. But I think so much goes haywire in cases of dementia and Alzheimer's disease that again we're back in a situation where I would be very hesitant. I'm really talking about a special case here. And it's important that we're talking about that special case, because when you get into more global kinds of cognitive failing, and messy kinds of cognitive failing, the sort that you're talking about, then I think we're not even sure how to take this case-by-case, piece-by-piece story and turn it into something that would work in those contexts. What I imagine, and this is 100 years, 50 years from now in this project, and I see this as kind of one step down the road, is suppose that we had a space of human agency that we could map out in some way, dimensions along which we could characterize, and we could draw a cloud in that space. Imagine a polar graph of some point. We can draw a cloud in it and say, so long as you're inside that cloud, you're a competent agent. But it might be that and then for any given case, we could try to see where they are on this multidimensional polar graph. And that instead of just having competent, incompetent as the two choices that are available to us, that thinking about it in that way might allow us to say competent for this, not competent for that, sometimes competent for this, never competent for that. And that, but at the moment, we don't even know what the dimensions of that polar graph are. And part of what I'm trying to do in this talk is to say, well, semantic knowledge of the future, caring about the future, valuing the future, etc. I didn't mention that, in biomedical ethics courses, everyone has to read this set of papers that's about whether abortion is permissible. And some people say, well, it's not, because you're killing something that has a future. And then, well, somebody says, well, yeah, it has a future, but rocks have futures. What matters is whether it's a future that's theirs, whether they can conceive that future. And that's a different thing. That's something that a fetus cannot do. But notice that what's happening here, when we say that they're locked in a permanent present tense, is to put them in that category that doesn't have a future of their own. It has a rock-like future, not a personal future. Anyhow, having a future of your own would be a dimension in all of this. And so part of what I'm hoping to do, what I'm hoping that this kind of thing would lead to, is thinking about what are the cognitive systems that have to be functioning and how well do they have to be functioning for a multidimensional assessment of one's competence that's more subtle about which kinds of activities we're interested in. But I think the one last thing, I think our intuitions about what we would want. If I ended up like Kent, I had a motorcycle accident tomorrow and damaged my hippocampus and was just like him. I think on the basis of what I've figured out about this, I want to speak for myself. That's my intuition. And that it's not just intuition, it's because I think all these things would be intact. And I don't want anyone speaking for me when I can think perfectly well for myself, thank you very much. And maybe I just value autonomy a lot, and I do. But I don't want somebody speaking for me if I'm capable of doing it for myself.
So I have one question with a possible follow-up. You had mentioned that their preferences, like their taste in music and other kind of like cultural aspects, hadn't changed much over time. Do they show any growth at all? It's just like, do they always just get fucked up? Or do they find and like discover new artists along the way through time?
I don't know yes, they do change.
Right.
Right? They do change. And there are forms of learning that are still available to them, like procedural learning.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, like John, this guy that I was describing who had an anoxic event in childbirth that damaged the hippocampus bilaterally, he managed to graduate from high school and maybe even university. So semantic learning was still available to him. Not in Kent. By the time when Kent had his motorcycle accident, anterior grade, all of the semantic learning was gone. But not in John. So I don't want to speak universally about it. Kent was still very much into Dylan. And I even once said, Dylan has a new album, and you might like it. He said, oh yeah, wow.
Well, it's just kind of interesting to me. It's just like, how do people develop like new preferences for things when you don't have a memory of listening to them? So it's like it almost seems like preferences as well.
My sense is that the idea that they're frozen in time is partly born by the fact that there's not a lot of growth and development here. That's my sense. But I don't want to speak, I know one guy well, and then I know a bunch of bar graphs. And the kind of thing that you're asking isn't in bar graphs.
Right.
So let's open it up to everybody now, and if I could just do a really quick, easy question.
Yeah.
Just to kick it off. So this project of tethering what a philosopher might regard as a person to a somewhat reductionist or third-person scientific mapping. So is there some sense of priority to the empirical inquiry? Not that it can be done independent of guiding questions that come from philosophy and so forth, but suppose that this notion of a person that you ascribe, that you want to tether to, is just a full construct that isn't real. Doesn't that undermine the whole enterprise of assuming a person?
It would, but it's not a fiction, and it is real. I mean, if what you're imagining is that I think there's a soul or something, and that's what I'm tethering, that's not at all what I have in mind. What I have in mind is a social creature that when asked why it does things, delivers reasons that make sense in light of what it knows. And I'm thinking about Dennett and the intentional stance to some extent. I'm not thinking about some additional entity in the world that somehow, when I talk about tethering, I guess makes it sound like it's a balloon that has to somehow get tethered down. But what I'm thinking about personhood as more of a social category, about how we treat one another. And it's in our relationships to one another. And I know that there are people, even here in California, the Churchlands, who hold that there are no persons. I think that's vile. I don't think they're vile. I like the Churchlands. But if you tell me to stop thinking of the people in this room as if they're somehow special in this world, somehow distinct from toads or something, I actually think you're asking me to do something that's vile, which is to take things that perfectly well have the ability to know what they're doing, to do things for reasons, to give their reasons, to be held, to hold themselves accountable for the things that they do, and to just say, I'm not going to pay any attention to that fact about humans. They're just machines to me. To me, that's just, if that's where philosophy takes me, then I want nothing to do with it. To me, there's a story to be told about humans and how we fit in this world. And the fact that you and I can have a conversation that's grounded in meaningful, I mean, this is not an illusion that you and I are talking to one another right now and making contact with, I could be a brain in a vat, sure. I also find that a somewhat vile philosophical view. It's hard to talk yourself out of it, but no, I just won't cede the idea that people are important, and important in virtue of their being in control of the actions that they engage in. I just won't take the eliminative hypothesis seriously, and I don't think anything in science has done anything to tarnish that.
I think there are interesting alternatives to the eliminativist version of that, but we'll save it for dinner.
Yeah, that'd be great, but I just, just everything that's valuable to me in this world is predicated on that thesis being false. And so we all have to decide where to begin our philosophy. And if you begin your philosophy with it's a material world and everything better fit with that hypothesis, damn it, you can do that. Actually, that's one of my starting hypotheses. But I also choose to plant a tack in the idea that people do things for reasons and are moral, that morality is not entirely illusory. There are things that are appropriate and inappropriate to do to another human being, and that's in virtue of the kind of thing that they are. And I want to know how being that kind of thing is possible in this world. And the Churchland thought that we're just machines moving about in the world under the influence of oxytocin or whatever, is a deeply depressing and hollow view of humanity. I don't think they have a single argument that can support that view. But we can talk about their arguments. I'd be happy to talk about those, but I don't think they have a single argument that supports that view. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about something much more mundane.
Yeah, that was the easy one, right?
Yeah. I'd actually like to ask about the claim that dual proxy is equivalent to dual consent is equivalent to consent by proxy. So just to clarify it, to make sure I'm getting this right. So consent by proxy means the proxy decides.
Yeah.
And the patient or whatever has no say.
Well, they assent. They can assent or not.
So, so I guess that's the important thing. So consent by proxy requires assent.
Yeah.
Okay, so so it's exactly the same.
It's either consent by proxy with assent, with the requirement of assent.
Or it's dual consent with...
Or it's dual consent, where there isn't, like, forget the assent issue, because he's perfectly capable of consenting for himself. And so you just ask them both for consent. That's the dual consent situation. Apparently in Australia, I gave this talk in Sydney not long ago, and apparently this is, Australia is making a move that all research on children will involve giving dual consent.
Because if it, like, as a parent, I'm thinking, like, that's not, it's consent by proxy with children, it's not like you don't ask the kids, right? The kids don't assent.
But if the kid went, get me out of here, you know, the experimenter is obliged to immediately stop the experiment, right? So they have to...
Yeah, in a biomedical sense, though. I mean, if the kid was like, I don't want to, and the parent goes, nah, you're going to do it. Like, the kid's probably going to do it.
Yeah, that's the biomedical case. That's a tough one.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, okay.
I'm interested in the fact that some of your measures are explicit and some of them are more implicit. You're looking at reactions in ways that don't exactly probe their understanding of what's going on. In the case of the explicit measures, since they have semantic knowledge, you could imagine that they're responding just by regurgitating semantic knowledge that they have.
Correct.
And it doesn't align at all with their actual experience.
Correct.
Or they could be delusional and they think it aligns with their experience, but it doesn't.
Correct.
So if you discount all of your explicit measures, if you don't have that to lean on, you only have the implicit measures, does your position change?
I think, maybe going back to the Churchland slightly, I do think that if I ask you about time and you about your temporal preferences, that we could make the same move. I could be talking to a delusional person, I could be talking to, and now we eliminate all of those explicit measures, and we're only going to accept the ones, then I definitely think I have to go, I have to, many of these, just somebody says they don't understand time, you say, like, let me ask you a few questions about time, and they answer it perfectly well. I say, well, I don't know if that's explicit or implicit. It demonstrates their variability. They don't say, what? Time? I'm utterly baffled. I have no idea what you're asking. No, they give answers, and the answers make sense. And so I don't think that they could fake. I guess they could have memorized the answers or something.
Or have a conceptual model that doesn't match their own personal experience.
So some of the measures are implicit, and if one were to eliminate the ability to use explicit measures, I'd have to, a lot. I haven't thought through exactly what damage it would do here, but I assume that the probabilistic discounting, the delayed discounting, the Allaysian stuff stays the same. I don't think the moral decision-making stuff does. The narrative capacity stuff, which I didn't talk about, would be fine, because the ability to spin a narrative is just the ability to spin a narrative. It doesn't require any conception. I think you are right that part of why I want the implicit stuff, there's a first level, do they understand time? Well, let's ask him. And then he gives you perfectly good answers. You say, great. But that doesn't prove that he cares about it, that he would make decisions that accord with that understanding. And that's why the experiments got more and more implicit in their measures as time went on in this talk. I don't know how to answer the question globally, but I think it's worth noting. But it's partly that we were aware of that and did try to tap these things in ways that didn't require explicit reports. But it's science, and which means that it's always capable. There's always a possible thing that's wrong, and there's a limited amount of time that we have to work with these guys too. And so I find, as a philosopher who can sit down one day and write a paper, science is already slow. But then when you build into it, having to make time to get to Toronto to meet the family, arrange a time where you can both be there, and then set up the experiment. I mean, these are years and years and years just to get even relatively simple experiments done. We're at the beginning. And what I'd really like to do, I think my next real task, I mean, I'm writing the book that just sort of summarizes all the stuff that we've already done. But what I'd really like to do is team up with Dan Trinnell, who's got a very large group of individuals with amnesia. Whereas Sheena at the moment has, 3 or 4, maybe 5 individuals that she works with different degrees of deficits. But what I really need is access to a larger population of those individuals, and they have to already have been prepared for me, and to some extent. Because doing all of just characterizing the deficit, characterizing the brain damage, and all of that, that's years and years and years of work just to even know what subject you're dealing with. There's a lot of stuff I want to do, but this is an especially delicate science in some ways. I think it's not like you just cook up the next experiment and go to the lab the next day and do it. It requires a lot of coordination with others, and that's maybe part of the explanation for why, at this stage of the game, we're still just breaking into the sophisticated. We're still just pulling things off the shelf and throwing them at him. But they're the easiest and most well-respected measures, and that's why we're using them. It's the inroad. But I don't mean to end this discussion. So,
Thank you.
You have asked the question.
So I think I have a similar curiosity to what Dave was just asking about. And if someone is just, if someone has a purely semantic understanding of the world because they don't have episodic memory, maybe, right? So they only understand the facts, and they have their entire model built up based on the facts of the world, right? That they've learned in that system. It makes sense to me, actually, even some of the implicit data would even make sense that maybe they don't really understand time other than as this, factual model, right? And don't understand it connected to themselves. And so you might even see things like how you had that data where the people were less or were more likely to do things that were future oriented, I think it was, right? The same people.
They were more likely to say that they're future.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. This, I think, is semantic.
Right.
There's no doubt that is just, I know, some of these I look at, the time one doesn't bother me so much. And again, if I can't show you John's florid prose about this, but it would just be really hard to read everything that he had to say about. He's on about Einstein. He's like, well, you see, if you get going fast enough, that's not. Well, maybe it's not delusional. It reflects that he's picked up some things about all of this, and but definitely on that Zimbardo, the Zimbardo temporal perspective inventory is what kind of person are you? Are you the kind of person who thinks it's best to party now and forget the work tomorrow, or are you the kind of person who, and he knows the right answers.
Right.
And I think that what we get on that test is just a report of the answers that he thinks he's supposed to give.
Right.
If I asked you, I'm not sure you're giving me anything else.
Right.
I think you're going to give me the answers that you think I want, because you're trying to give the answer. I mean, this is also a problem with psych research, right? That they're going to give you, but that's why we do these other things, like the discounting task is not like, do you want $1 now or $100, but it's a series of presentations of choices that are all scrambled up. And then in the end, we're able to take those scrambled up choices and represent them in a nice discounting curve. But each choice independently is all scrambled. They can't figure out where they are in this choice process. And so they're just telling you, yeah, well, $80 today versus $180 in 3 weeks. And so I think there we're starting to get away from just them telling us semantically what they think we want to hear and getting at their valuations. And I don't think they're just trying to please us, because I think the way that this thing is set up, because Len and Joel mostly work with pigeons, and they do discounting in pigeons, and they want to set it up so that you can do it in humans as well, and they have. And the way that they do it is by allowing people to take, they water deprive people till they're thirsty, and then give them the opportunity to take sips of fluid, and they can trade, fewer sips, like a smaller sip now for a larger sip in 2 minutes or something, right? And it turns out that if you do that, humans and pigeons look a lot alike in their choices on this stuff. And there was a thought, well, we should bring him down and put him in the juice machine. But we haven't done that.
Right.
And everyone tells me, Len and Joel in particular, that the fact that we do it with hypothetical rewards doesn't make any difference to the outcome. Again, it's science, could be wrong, but that's the claim. I still would really like to do it sometime with something, because I'd like to take him to a casino. I mean, that would be, here's $500. What are you going to do? All Black 13, all of it, and then everything I think goes out the window at that point.
Well, we'll have to leave it at Black 13. So
Okay.
please sign in and let's thank our speakers.